Welcome dear audience, students and scholars. Here I'm Dr. Amjad. Dear scholars, once William Mackenzie Martin said that the Fed Reserve job is to take away the punch below just as the party gets going. And following this statement, Milton Friedman said that what we need is not a skilled monetary driver of the economic vehicle continually turning the steering wheel to adjust to the unexpected irregularities of the route, but some means of keeping the monetary passenger who is in the back seat as blast from occasionally learning over and giving the steering wheel a jig that threatens to send the car off the road. So dear scholars, here we have to discuss one of the main questions that how should government policymakers respond to the business cycle? The two quotations that we have discussed here, the first from a former chairman of the Fed Reserve and the second from the prominent critics of the Fed, show the diversity of the opinion over how this question is best answered. Some economists such as William Mackenzie Martin view the economy as inherently unstable. They argue that the economy experiences frequent shocks in aggregate demand and aggregate supply. Unless policymakers use monetary and fiscal policy to stabilize the economy, these shocks will lead to unnecessary and inefficient fluctuations in output, unemployment, and inflation. According to the popular saying, macroeconomic policy should lean against the wind, stimulating the economy when it is depressed and slowing the economy when it is overheated. Other economists such as Milton Friedman view the economy as naturally stable. They blame bad economic policies for the large and inefficient fluctuations we have sometimes experienced. They argue that the economic policy should not try to fine-tune the economy. Instead, economic policymakers should admit their limited abilities and be satisfied if they do not harm. So for this purpose, in this video we are going to discuss stabilization policy, and one of the main questions that should policy be active or passive. Okay, introduction. Policymakers in the federal government view economic stabilization as one of their primary responsibilities. The analysis of macroeconomic policy is a regular duty of the Council of Economic Advisors, the Congress Budget Office, the Federal Reserve, and other government agencies. Monetary and fiscal policy can exert a powerful impact on aggregate demand and thereby on inflation and unemployment. Okay, when Congress or the President is considering a major change in fiscal policy, or when the Fed Reserve is considering a major change in monetary policy, foremost in the discussion are how the change will influence inflation and unemployment, and whether aggregate demand needs to be stimulated or restrained. Okay, here we have one of the main important events, the Employment Act of 1946. Okay, although the government has long conducted monetary and fiscal policy, the view that it should use these policy instruments to try to stabilize the economy is more recent. The Employment Act of 1946 was a landmark piece of legislation in which the government first held itself accountable for macroeconomic performance. The Act states that it is the continuing policy and responsibility of the federal government to promote full employment and production. This law was written when the memory of the Great Depression was still fresh. The lawmakers who wrote it believed, as many economists do, that in the absence of an active government role in the economy, events like the Great Depression would occur regularly. Okay, here we have a main thing to discuss, the role of policy. It may be fiscal policy, it may be monetary policy. To many economists, the case for active government policy is clear and simple. Recessions are periods of high unemployment, low incomes, and increased economic hardship. The model of aggregate demand and aggregate supply shows how shocks to the economy can cause recessions. It also shows how monetary and fiscal policy can prevent or at least soften the episodes of recession by responding to these shocks. The economists for this ideology consider it wasteful not to use these policy instruments to stabilize the economy. While other economists are critical of the government's attempt to stabilize the economy, these critics argue that the government should take a hands-off approach to macroeconomic policy. At first, this view might seem surprising if our model shows how to prevent or reduce the severity of recessions. Why do these critics want the government to refrain from using monetary and fiscal policy for economic stabilization? To find out the answer of this question, let's consider some of their arguments. So for this purpose, let's first discuss the lags in the implication and effects of policies. Economic stabilization be easy if the effects of policy were immediate. Making policy would be like driving a car. Policymakers would simply adjust their instruments to keep the economy on the desired path. Making economic policy, however, is less like driving a car than it is like piloting a large ship. A car changes direction almost immediately after steering wheel is turned, but contrast, a ship changes course long after the pilot adjusts the rudder, and once the ship starts to turning, it continues turning long after the rudder is set back to normal. A no-wise pilot is likely to oversteering and after noticing the mistake overreact by steering too much to the opposite direction. The ship's path could become unstable as the no-wise response to previous mistakes by making larger and larger corrections. Like a ship pilot, economic policies and the policy makers face the problem of long lags. Instead, the problem for policymakers is even more difficult because the lengths of the lags are hard to predict. These long and variable lags directly complicate the conduct of monetary and fiscal policy. So for this purpose, economists distinguish between two lags that are relevant for the conduct of stabilization policies, the inside lag and the outside lag. Okay, while talking about the inside lag is the time between a shock to the economy and the policy action responding to that shock. Okay, this lag arises because it takes time for policymakers first to recognize that a shock has occurred and then to put appropriate policies into effect. Okay, while talking about the outside lag is the time between a policy action and its influence on the economy. This lag arises because policies do not immediately influence spending, income, and employment. Okay, while the further discussion about the lags in the implications and effects of policies, a long inside lag is a central problem with using fiscal policy for economic stabilization. This is especially true in the United States, where changes in spending or taxes require the approval of the president and both houses of Congress. Okay, the slow and cumbersome legislative process often leads to delays, which make fiscal policy an imprecise tool for stabilizing the economy. Okay, this inside lag is shorter in countries where parliamentary systems such as the United Kingdom, because there the party in the power can often enact policy changes more rapidly. Okay, moving toward the further discussion about the lags in the implementation and effects of policy. The monetary policy has a much shorter inside lag than fiscal policy, because a central bank can decide on and implement a policy change in less than a day, but monetary policy has a substantial outside lag. Monetary policy works by changing the money supply and interest rates, which in turn influence investment and aggregate demand. Many firms make investment plans in advance. However, so a change in monetary policy is thought not to affect economic activity until about 6 months after it is made. Okay, the long and variable lags associated with monetary and fiscal policies certainly make stabilizing the economy more difficult. Advocates of passive policy argue that because of these lags, successful stabilization policy is almost impossible. Okay, indeed, attempts to stabilize the economy can be destabilizing. Actually, okay, then suppose that the economy's condition changes between the beginning of a policy action and its impact on the economy. In this case, active policy may end up stimulating the economy when it is heating up, or depressing the economy when it is cooling off. Okay, advocates of active policy admit that such lags do require policymakers to be conscious, but they argue these lags do not necessarily mean that policy should be completely passive, especially in the face of a severe and protracted economic downturn such as the recession that began in 2008. So here we have one of the main policy action, that is automatic stabilizers. Some policies called automatic stabilizers are designed to reduce the lags associated with stabilization policy. Automatic stabilizers are policies that stimulate or depress the economy when necessary without any deliberate policy change. For example, the system of income taxes automatically reduces taxes when the economy goes into a recession without any change in the tax laws, because individuals and corporations pay less tax when their incomes fall. So similarly, the unemployment insurance and welfare systems automatically raise transfer payments when the economy moves into a recession because more people apply for benefits. So one can view these automatic stabilizers are a type of fiscal policy without any inside lag. Okay, then we have one of the main problems to discuss, the difficult job of economic forecasting. Because policy influences the economy only after a long lag, successful stabilization policy requires the ability to predict accurately future economic conditions. If we cannot predict whether the economy will be in a boom or a recession in 6 months or a year, we cannot evaluate whether monetary and fiscal policy should not be trying to expand or contract aggregate demand. Unfortunately, economic developments are often unpredictable, at least given our current understanding of the economy. Okay, one way forecasters try to look ahead is what leading indicators. A leading indicator is a data series that fluctuates in advance of the economy. Okay, a large fall in a leading indicator signals that a recession is more likely to occur in the coming months. So moving toward the further discussion related to the difficult job of economic forecasting, another way forecasters look ahead is with macroeconometric models which have been developed both by government agencies and by private firms for forecasting and policy analysis. These large-scale computer models are made up of many equations, each representing a part of the economy. After making assumptions about the path of the exogenous variables such as monetary policy, fiscal policy, and oil prices, these models yield a prediction about unemployment, inflation, and other endogenous variables. So keep it in mind, however, that the validity of these predictions is only as good as the model and the forecasters' assumptions about exogenous variables. Okay, let's move our discussion to another interesting topic that is ignorance expectations and the locus critic. Okay, the prominent economist Robert Lucas once wrote, as an advice-giving profession, we are in a way over our heads. Even many of those who advise policymakers would agree with this statement. Economics is a young science and there is still much that we do not know. Economists cannot be completely confident when they assess the effects of alternative policies. This ignorance suggests that economists should be cautious when offering policy advice. Okay, while the further discussion about the ignorance expectations and the Lucas critic. In his writing, Lucas mentioned that on macroeconomic policy making, Lucas has emphasized that economists need to pay more attention to the issue of how people form expectations of the future. Expectations play a critical role or crucial role in the economy, because they influence all sorts of behavior. For instance, households decide how much to consume based on how much they expect to earn in the future, and the firm decide how much to invest based on their expectations of future profitability. Okay, these expectations depend on many things, but one factor, according to Lucas, is especially important: the policies being pursued by the government. When policymakers estimate the effect of any policy change, therefore they need to know how people's expectation will respond to the policy change. Okay, Lucas has argued that traditional methods of policy evaluation, such as those that rely on standard macroeconometric model, do not adequately take into account the impact of policy on expectation. This criticism of traditional policy evaluation is known as the Lucas critique. An important example of the Lucas critique rises in the analysis of disinflation. The cost of reducing inflation is often measured by the sacrifice ratio, which is the number of percentage points of GDP that must be foregone to reduce inflation by 1 percentage point. Because estimates of the sacrifice ratio are often large, they have led some economists to argue that policymakers should learn to live with inflation rather than incur the large cost of reducing it. Okay, moving toward the further discussion about the ignorance expectation and the Lucas critique. According to advocates of the rational expectation approach, however, these estimates of the sacrifice ratio are unreliable because they are subject to the Lucas critique. Traditional estimates of the sacrifice ratio are based on adaptive expectation, that is, on the assumption that expected inflation depends on past inflation. Adaptive expectation may be a reasonable premise in some circumstances, but if the policymakers make a credible change in policy, workers and firms setting wages and prices will rationally respond by adjusting their expectations of inflation appropriately. This change in inflation expectation will quickly alter the short-run trade-off between inflation and unemployment. As a result, reducing inflation can potentially be much less costly than is suggested by traditional estimates of the sacrifice ratio. So the Lucas critique leaves us with two lessons. The narrow lesson is that economists evaluating alternative policies need to consider how policy affects expectations and thereby behavior. The broad lesson is that policy evaluation is hard, so economists engaged in this task should be sure to show the requisites humilities. So moving towards the historical record for the stabilization policy in judging whether government policy should play an active or passive role in the economy, we must give some weight to the historical record. If the economy has experienced many large shocks to aggregate supply and aggregate demand, and if policy has successfully floated the economy from these shocks, then the case for active policy should be clear. Okay, conversely, if the economy has experienced a few large shocks and if the fluctuations we have observed can be traced to inept economic policy, then the case for passive policy should be clear. So in other words, our view of stabilization policy should be influenced by whether policy has historically been stabilizing or destabilizing. For this reason, the debate over macroeconomic policy frequently turns into a debate over macroeconomic history. Okay, yet history does not settle the debate over stabilization policy. Disagreements over history arise because it is not easy to identify the sources of economic fluctuations. The historical record often permits more than one interpretation. Okay, moving toward the further explanation about the historical record, the Great Depression is a case in point. Economists' views on macroeconomic policy are often related to their views on the cause of the depression. Some economists believe that a large contractionary shock to private spending caused the depression. They assert that policymakers should have responded by using the tools of monetary and fiscal policy to stimulate aggregate demand. Okay, other economists believe that the large fall in the money supply caused the Great Depression. They assert that the depression would have been avoided if the Fed had been pursuing a passive monetary policy of increasing the money supply at a steady rate. Hence, depending on one's beliefs about its cause, the Great Depression can be viewed either as an example of why active monetary and fiscal policy is necessary or as an example of why it is dangerous. So this is all about the stabilization policy. We have discussed one of the main questions, that should policy be active or passive. So see you with another video. Ciao.